Part of Vltava from Smetana's cycle of tone poems Ma Vlast, My Country. It was played there by the Czech Philharmonic Orchestra, conducted by its chief conductor Semyon Bychkov, a much-acclaimed pentatone recording released last year. I'm James Jolly and welcome to this Gramophone Podcast, which this week is given in association with Bratislava Cantans, the music festival held every September in the Polish city of Wrocław and the surrounding area. This year, under the title Paradise Lost, the festival sees performances of a new work by Zygmunt Krause, Requiem, dedicated to the most innocent victims of wars, children, alongside great classical works like Mozart's Coronation Mass and Beethoven's Eroica Symphony, which will be performed by Il Giardino Armonico and Giovanni Antonini, a former artistic director of the festival. Visiting musicians include the French violinist Théotime Langlois de Swart, with the lutenist Thomas Dunford, the pianist Marta Argerich, Sir John Eliot Gardner conducting Mendelssohn, Christoph Eschenbach conducting Act 3 of Wagner's Parsifal, and Vox Luminis and Lionel Meunier, among many others. And of course, some of Poland's finest performers too. More information at the end. The Czech Philharmonic was voted Gramophone's Orchestra of the Year at last year's Gramophone Classical Music Awards. Well, this coming October sees another orchestra take the baton from the Czech Phil. And to reveal the field and offer a few thoughts on the contending ensembles, I'm joined by Gramophone's publisher and editor, Martin Cullingford.
Hello, James.
Now, what were you looking for when you came up with the shortlist this year?
First and foremost, we're looking for musical excellence, but that is a given, and such is the extraordinary standard of orchestral achievement across the world at the moment that there's no shortage of orchestras to choose from. But I think particularly we're looking for excellence on record across the past year, a commitment to recording, a belief that recording is an integral part of that orchestra's life and identity, and then looking for recordings that reflect imaginative and interesting choices of repertoire, which you give a sense of what that orchestra is doing at that point of time, where its journey is heading, what the partnership is with both the conductor, we're going to talk a lot about conductors, and also their audiences too.
Now, last year's Orchestra of the Year, the Czech Philharmonic, celebrated a particularly close relationship between conductor and ensemble. And among this year's half-dozen contenders, we have a few similar, very successful partnerships. So let's start with one orchestra that sits apart from the other five in that it plays on period instruments, and that's Le Concert des Nations, founded in 1989 by Jordi Savall, the Catalan gamba player and conductor. And it also serves as the instrumental partner to his vocal ensemble, La Capella Real de Catalunya. So what set them apart?
Really, this is an orchestra that feels almost set apart from a lot of other orchestras, and actually from this list as a whole. Jordi Savall is a conductor who really stood out for forging a career almost unique in its exploration of the sort of meeting point of early music and other cultures, and everything's always presented in these beautifully lavish books by his label Alia Vox, which really offer rich context. However, in certainly more recent years, he's expanded into sort of repertoire that goes in a very different place to a lot of that. I mean, there's an extraordinary Beethoven set. But looking over the last year, the recent recording was something entirely unexpected. The number 0 D-minor Symphony of Bruckner and the unfinished by Schumann. And then also over the past year, there was a really wonderful recording of Mendelssohn's A Midsummer Night's Dream, which was sort of equally a labour of love of all of his projects, drawing on poetry, having people reading the poetry. And there's a wonderful sense of the drama of that. And I think what really stands out for me is that the clarity that is something that feels such a part of all his exploration of early music and that ensemble's awareness of it really does seem to come through in works of a much later era.
It is quite interesting, actually, the conductors who approach the sort of the late classical romantic repertoire, as it were, from the other side. So they come forward to it and bump into it, as it were, instead of going back. Because most, the traditional sort of repertoire for a symphonic conductor is sort of Haydn and Mozart to the present day. And there are a few that have come, as it were, from the beginning on. I mean, one thinks of someone like Franz Bruchen, and when he did the Eroica, years ago with the Orchestra of the 18th Century, I mean, that was really quite an amazing statement. And it's very similar with Savall, the way he sort of approaches. I mean, certainly his Beethoven was really interesting. There was a sort of clarity, and there was a kind of that stability and the rock solid foundation that his Baroque training, I think, would have helped. I mean, It's a very interesting coupling, this, as you say, Bruckner Die Nullte and the Schumann Zwickauer Symphony. I mean, neither exactly sort of core works, but it's the orchestra as well that we're looking at here. I mean,
Yeah.
I love the sound he gets from these people.
No, absolutely. And I think by having worked, as you say, in repertoire almost moving forward, they're constantly asking questions about how something should be done, whether that's a conscious question or a subconscious question. And yeah, they in this music you can hear extraordinary instrumentation, musicianship, virtuosity, but just an extraordinary sense of rapport, really. And I think particularly works that will be slightly less known. I think to have that just makes it feel very convincing and coherent. But there is that almost wonderful sort of a combination of lightness and weight. It doesn't feel very rooted down, but yet there still feels like a sense of grandeur, but it's given a real sense of pace and dynamism.
I mean, when the Concert des Nations was founded, it was very much drawing on musicians from the sort of Mediterranean countries, sort of Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Latin American. I don't know how much that still holds true, but there's a real vibrancy and there's a kind of passion in the playing that one can easily sort of, as it were, retrofit, knowing that information.
No, absolutely, yes, it does. It's a different sort of sound to sort of Northern Germanic or the traditional sort of English orchestral sound. And yes, I don't know. You're right. I don't know actually what the makeup of the current orchestra is, but certainly that culture and that feeling, and the fact that so many of their collaborations in the past, you talk about around the Mediterranean, but they've often worked with orchestras from, as it were, the other side of the Mediterranean, which I think would have just sort of informed them as musicians in terms of how they think about rhythm and timing and rapport and relationships.
Well, let's hear them. This is a little bit of the scherzo from Bruckner's Symphony Die Nullte, number 0. Now, the Halle Orchestra has just started a new chapter with a new conductor, Kachun Wong, who's just nearing the end of his first season with them. And he's already released 2 very fine different recordings, Bruckner's Ninth and Britain's Ballet School, The Prince of the Begodias. But he succeeds someone who has very much shaped the sound and style of the modern Halle, Sir Mark Elder. He was the orchestra's principal conductor for 24 years, from 2000 to 2024, a tenure only exceeded by Sir Charles Halle's 38 years and Sir John Barbarolli's 27. So, I mean, in a way, this nomination is twofold: recognition of Elder's work and the huge potential of Wong's reign.
Absolutely. I mean, it is an orchestra at a point of transition. And sometimes transitions can be moments of uncertainty, but actually in this case, I really think it's a moment of discovery and excitement. It really is an orchestra drawing on that really remarkable quarter of a century of Mark Elder's leadership. And one just thinks of, I mean, that was an orchestra with a real commitment to recording his Elgar, his Vaughan Williams, but also into Nielsen and Wagner too. And through all of that process, there is an orchestra which just has a wonderful sense of identity, of coherence, of sound. And then in Kachun Wong, they've, I think, very sensibly chosen someone who is very different, really, as a figure. I mean, he's an incredibly thoughtful musician with a lot of ideas, but he's also someone who brings a very different style. I mean, to watch him conduct is absolutely fascinating. He's incredibly almost balletic with his movement. If you ever want to watch a conductor and in order to see what they're actually doing at that moment in time, you can really see him shaping the orchestra in real time. The audiences really love watching him. And as for regards to recording, I mean, it was a fascinating first choice, I thought, Britain's Prince of Pagoda score. It wasn't a work I knew terribly well, which I probably shouldn't admit for someone who grew up in Benjamin Britten's hometown. But it's a work really rich in colours, which he brings out rather wonderfully. There's obviously the dance element in it, but there's this kind of almost kaleidoscopic tapestry in there, which just enabled him to demonstrate his ability to draw that out of the orchestra. I mean, the first work that he and the orchestra had really bonded over was Shostakovich's Fifth Symphony, which actually saw them perform again quite recently in Bridgewater Hall. I mean, they're very lucky to have this amazing hall in Manchester with an extraordinary sound. And you can just sense there's a real excitement and relationship with them. The next work that they then recorded was Bruckner's Symphony No. 9, a very different work to the Britain. And there, the spirituality of the work and its sort of great depth and sweep was something that, again, he had really thought about. And he's written actually quite personally about how that relates to his own background and his own approach and ethos to...
Because he comes from Singapore.
He does, yeah. And he was talking about how it feels sort of artificial to try and put two thoughts together, but he talked about how that notion of reflecting on life and time and passing was something that he felt actually worked really well when contemplating the Bruckner. So I think there's a really exciting chapter ahead for them. But then again, let's not forget Mark Elder, who's still very much involved with the orchestra. I think his title is Conductor Emeritus. And actually, one of the wonderful recordings of this past year period was the recording of Simon Boccanegra, the sort of initial version of it, which the Halle recorded with Opera Rara. And so Mark's a really wonderful opera conductor, and he worked wonderfully with singers, particularly actually Opera Rara, which often draws on some quite exciting young singers. And again, just creates something that is a wonderfully vivid and an enjoyable listen.
Well, let's hear the orchestra with their new chief conductor, Kachun Wong. This is from the Britain recording, The Prince of Pagodas. This is Act 1, a little part of The King's Kneel Before Bella Rose. Now, the BBC Symphony Orchestra, which marks its centenary in 5 years' time, has been conducted by Sakari Oromo since 2013, and he's really stamped his personality on them. And that personality, I think, is characterised by amazingly eclectic musical sympathies.
Absolutely. I mean, the BBC Symphony Orchestra has a quite specific place in UK musical life. First and foremost, it's a London-based ensemble, but one really at the heart of the broadcaster, the BBC, which gives it a special prominence and responsibility.
And it's an orchestra that's, it lives in front of the microphone. I mean, it probably, gives more concerts that are recorded than aren't.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And broadcast, one sees it from the bookends at the beginning end of the problems among much else. And I guess it's therefore recording is in its DNA, to use that phrase that people often use. You talk about diversity, and actually we'll obviously go on to talk about Sakari Oromo and his leadership of the orchestra, but actually over the past year, several projects they've been involved in have really shown this. Actually, another thing that defines the BBC Symphony very well is well as being committed to recordings, also committed to contemporary music, to sort of pushing our understanding of music further forward. And there's a wonderful project that they did with Dalia Staszewska called her Mixtape, which sort of defines the personal nature of that project. And it was her journey through a real range of contemporary music from Caroline Shaw, Anna Meredith, Johan Johansson, Judith Weir, many others. And it really just showed an orchestra who were able to excel in all those different sorts of styles.
And also recording techniques, because quite a lot of them used things like sort of click tracks and stuff like that.
Yes.
Quite sort of modern, but they really can turn their hand to anything.
No, I mean, they're very versatile in the same way that something like a sister ensemble for them, the BBC Singers, is just incredibly good at just adding something to a project that perhaps few ensembles can do quite so superbly and so brilliantly. That was also another wonderful attempt. This was on the Platoon label to perhaps rethink what releases and recordings can be. It was sort of put out bit by bit. Although the wonderful title Mixtape also has an air of nostalgia for people of my age who remember exactly what a mixtape was.
We should also point out that actually there's a whole series of podcasts that Andrew Mellor made with Dalia Staszewska and the various composers as they worked their way through this mixtape, worth tracking down.
No, I mean, that added actually fascinating insight. But also another contemporary composer, though actually obviously no longer with us just by a few years, Anthony Payne. They recorded a recording called Visions and Journeys, which was orchestral music by him that had been unreleased. And Martin Brabbins conducted that. And again, that was a very, very beautiful album, which I think also showed their relationship with different conductors can also be ones that bring something very different to them. But Sakari Oromu obviously is their leader, their conductor since 2013, and he's also extended his contract right up until the century that you point out, but also the orchestra's moved to their new home in Stratford, East London, where they'll be moving from Maida Vale to a purpose-built venue there. And I mean, he's obviously someone who just has you can hear the wonderful relationship with them. The fact that he often takes them on his own musical explorations.
And on one journey that's currently underway, in fact, we've just had the second album out of the series, is orchestral music by the Polish composer Grażyna Bacewicz. A great discovery. I mean, I think a lot of us have known her music, and rather like Florence Price, she's been sort of thrust into the limelight over the last few years. But this is really wonderful music, and I wasn't actually familiar of her large scale stuff. I know a lot of her chamber music. I mean, it's got things like the Second Symphony, which is a terrific piece.
Yeah, no, it is. It was her chamber music that I first heard, and likewise the large scale music is something we're getting to know much better, and she really bears being put into that limelight. And what's rather wonderful, Oromo himself talks about, actually, for him, this was a discovery that perhaps came later than he might liked it to have been, but one he really believes in. And to have an orchestra like that, where he can work with them, share his discoveries with them, discoveries obviously for audiences is too. But her music, I think, does demonstrate so much the strength of the orchestra. I mean, it's wonderfully written, managing to fill both of the 20th century, but also actually referencing styles both before that, but also looking ahead to the future. Perhaps it feels sort of tailor-made for a group of players like this. And also on that recording is the piano concerto played by Peter Donohoe, and again a chance to hear them working in partnership with a soloist in a work like that.
And there's something sort of quite old-fashioned in the way that orchestras back in the day used to come together, rehearse, record, release the recording, and nobody would ever hear a note until it came out. I suspect these were broadcast, but at the same time, it does show the strength of an orchestra that, with an inspiring conductor, interesting music, they can actually go in and work really in a concentrated way and create something for the recorded medium.
No, they can, and when time is often tight for a lot of ensembles, and money is often tight, to have an ensemble like this where they have the privilege and luxury of time to really just be able to explore and devote in that way, I think is a wonderful thing.
Well, let's hear a little bit of Grażyna Bacewicz's Second Symphony. This is the scherzo, the opening thereof. That was a British orchestra directed by one of the many major Finnish conductors of our time, Sakari Oromo. Well, up in Helsinki, the tables have been turned, and the Finnish Radio Symphony Orchestra is conducted by a Brit, Nicholas Collon, well known for his work with Aurora. This is another radio orchestra I think is worth pointing out.
No, maybe there's a theme here, orchestras who are just well used to sitting in front of microphones and making music in front of them. Another radio orchestra, not a very, very fine orchestra, and particularly standout recordings from this past year include A Dream of Grontius, which I thought was really very powerful, actually, and obviously it follows only a year after Paul McCreish's recording of A Dream of Grontius. Elgar's great oratorio won a Gramophone Award, but this is a demonstration, I think, of actually how a different orchestra can have something very different to say about it. And of course, what's quite interesting is, though I've always thought actually there are strong links between a lot of Finnish music and the work of people like Sibelius and actually late Romantic English music, something about the sound world and the soundscape feels quite familiar. But even so, it's an orchestra whose players would not have been as immersed in the Elgarian world as players in Britain would have been. So perhaps you can hear something of that in there, a sort of slight sense for them of newness and discovery, and perhaps just bringing something slightly different to it. Elgar himself obviously thought of himself as really part of that wider European tradition of music making, And it's wonderful to hear an orchestra like that perform this so wonderfully. Under, of course, the baton of Nicholas Collin, who is someone who is coming from the British musical world and actually being an advocate for that repertoire with them. But then the other really wonderful recording from them was the recording of Sibelius's music, the Sibelius Fifth that they released recently. Obviously, that's repertoire the orchestra will have known intimately, and I thought this was a really wonderful performance. I mean, it's, if it doesn't sound trite, I think that Sibelius's Fifth is one of the loveliest of symphonies, and when that great theme returns in the final movement, it's one of the most energizing and moving moments in the orchestral repertoire. And it's handled so wonderfully here. I was listening to it again actually this morning, just preparing for this discussion, and there's no real sense of dwelling and weight at that moment. It actually feels like there's a almost quite pacey sense of bringing in of that theme. There's grandeur, as there should be at the moment. That's what's going on there, and yet it also still feels very much of it's a sense of movement and progression, and the orchestra do that incredibly well.
I mean, Sibelius is one of those composers that, you know, he is very much an international composer, and he's performed the world over. But actually, when you hear a Finnish orchestra in Sibelius's music, they do bring something that's very difficult to put your finger on, but there's a quality, and whether it's a pacing, a colour, and it's really quite a treat. And then, of course, you know, a British conductor. I mean, we have an amazing Sibelius tradition. I mean, the first Sibelius symphonies were recorded in London by the London Symphony Orchestra. So there is a real sort of synergy between conductor and orchestra here. But I think it's really very special, as you say, in this Symphony 5, a fantastic recording.
Yeah, no. So what is the sound of an orchestra related to its national place? And yes, I imagine just being immersed in Finland, seeing the light through the trees in the same way that Sibelius would have seen from his composing home. It must inform something about how you think about what he's trying to depict there. You mentioned colour, and I think colour is the essence there. It seems to be natural and instinctive, not something that's had to be worked out and thought about. They're very, very fine. And by being a radio orchestra, as advocates for music to their country, to their audiences, I think that's a responsibility you can hear that they enjoy and relish and take very seriously.
Well, let's hear that moment you referred to from the third movement, Allegro Molto, from Sibelius's Fifth Symphony. Well, let's stay in Northern Europe for our fifth orchestra, and one currently without a chief conductor, the Bergen Philharmonic. Edward Gardner left last year to head up Norway's Opera House, but not before leaving some spectacular recordings. And it's an orchestra with a very long recording heritage.
No, and an orchestra with a very long heritage, in fact, and so for recording was sort of part of their journey, really, from early on in the 20th century. Also, another reminder, a bit like orchestras like the Halle, that an ensemble not based in a capital city can really have an extraordinary sense of identity with the right relationships with its audiences, with its community, but with its conductors. They can really almost have a sort of freedom to work out who they are and to really create a sense of identity. Their period with Edward Gardner, I think, has been an incredibly successful one. So many very fine recordings have come out over that period of time, and obviously he's still retaining a role with them, and I'm sure we'll hear more from them collectively. But just over the last year or so, I mean, most recently there was a wonderful recording of Salome, rich in drama. Malin Bistrom was the title role in that, and in that you can of course hear Edward Gardner's experience of working in opera. He was at English National Opera for a number of years. And even though this is an orchestra, that sense of the storytelling, the drama, the slow unfolding of drama, and an awareness to the moments where it just twists and turns is something that they do absolutely wonderfully. Earlier in the year, we also had a Brahms Eine Deutsche Requiem very different repertoire. But again, an excellent example of how they can embody what a composer is asking of them.
And it's beautifully recorded at times.
It is beautifully recorded. In fact, all of their things are beautifully recorded, and perhaps that's something that defines them. I think that relationship to recording over such
and Vandals have a long experience of recording in Bergen, so they kind of know the hall. They know exactly what to do, and they deliver pretty well every time.
They do. In Chandos, of course, a label whose commitment to orchestral sound and to working with Gardner as well is obviously a commitment that's there. No, and it's fascinating. We think back to our earlier pieces they did, the Peter Grimes, where again there's just a sense of an orchestra creating a sense of colour and richness, but also sort of lightness and space when required. It'd be interesting to see who they appoint, whether they look for a figure like Edward Gardner or whether actually they look for someone who can take them off in different directions. But whoever inherits them will inherit an orchestra that's really been as richly developed as actually Kachin Wong and the Halle under Mark Elder. And actually there's a nice link there, Edward Gardner having been an assistant conductor under Mark Elder at the Halle, and actually Mark Elder also being someone who works with the Bergen Philharmonic too.
Well, let's hear a little bit about Salome recording. Here's a clip from the Dance of the Seven Veils. Now an orchestra from across the pond, and one with a very long tradition in the recording studio, the Boston Symphony Orchestra. And I was amazed to discover that Anders Nilssons has been there since 2014. I mean, a really substantial reign. If somebody asked me, I'd have said, 4 or 5 years.
No, absolutely. And in fact, the project that really caught my imagination, why we've decided to include them in this list, is also something that goes back a long period of time, which is their complete recording of the Shostakovich symphonies and the concertos, and actually also the opera Lady Macbeth of Mitseng. I mean, it's a really extraordinary capturing of an orchestra following a journey through this quite remarkable music, and the way they capture Shostakovich's sort of edgy sound, that slight sense of fear and terror through much of it, melodies that can be both lyrical and then just slightly undercut by that sort of uncertainty. There's something I think about Shostakovich's music. You can just hear a small bar of it and know immediately that this couldn't be by anyone else. And that's clearly something they've just lived with for a decade now, ever since actually they won a Gramophone Award in 2015 for Symphony No. 10. And so here we are at the journey's end with a box set, but of course you can hear it having been released bit by bit over time on streaming services. And I think an extraordinary contribution to the Shostakovich year.
Because Shostakovich is not a composer you necessarily associate with the Boston Symphony. Or, if one mentions that orchestra, you'd say, oh yes, French music, they were very fine in that. And the classical tradition, there's some, wonderful Brahms recordings that have come out from Boston. But Shostakovich, they really, it's a fabulous, as you say, a fabulous sound, and they just get that sort of spirit of this music, sort of defiant.
Defiant. That's a good way of putting it. No, it's interesting. I hadn't really thought about that in terms of its place in their catalogue. I mean, most gramophone readers will have a lot of Boston Symphony Orchestra recordings in their catalogue, and whether that's something that all of that heritage they've brought to it, whether it's actually something that Anders Nilssons has brought to it. And he speaks with quite commitment about this being music in its own right. We can always tie Shostakovich's music so tightly to his own life and context. Obviously, Anders Nilssons, someone who grew up starting off behind the Iron Curtain, will know very well actually the sort of thoughts and feelings that would have lay behind much of this in the society in which it was created. And And yet here he is as an advocate for this work, with an orchestra who, I mean, they are just such a superb orchestra. There are so many members of it that would be astounding soloists in any other circumstance, and collectively, that's something actually that's always been true of them. And yet collectively, therefore, they can provide amazing coherence whilst you still have an identity of different instruments, different, and that's really important in Shostakovich. There are moments of isolation of instruments, where different instruments are almost taking on solo roles throughout the symphonic works. And actually, perhaps therefore, this is an ideal orchestra to explore this work. And of course, we should mention the concertos, of which the soloist Yu Zhao Wang, Baba Skride, Yo-Yo Ma, all people who bring very personal things to those works. But again, the orchestra as equal partners throughout them. Andras Nelson's as a conductor who's very alert and alive to following the particular paths those soloists are taking those works on as well.
Well, let's hear a little bit of the Shostakovich second piano concerto. As you say, Yu Zhao Wang, the soloist. This is the opening. Now, the Orchestra of the Year award is voted on by the public, and voting runs from now until August the 18th. Simply head over to gramophone.co.uk/awards and cast your vote. And the results will be revealed at the Gramophone Classical Music Awards 2025 on October the 15th. And my thanks to Gramophone's publisher and editor, Martin Cullingford, for sharing his thoughts about the Orchestra of the Year 2025 nominees. This podcast was given in association with the 60th International Festival Wrocławia Cantans, which takes place between September the 4th and 14th in the Polish city of Wrocław and the surrounding area. This year, with the title Paradise Lost, and under the artistic direction of Andrzej Kosendiak, the festival plays host to both local and visiting musicians and is one of Europe's most imaginative celebrations of music, ancient and modern. If you search for Gramophone Paradise Lost, you can read an article by Charlotte Gardner about this year's Wrocławia Cantans. For full information, including how to buy tickets, just go to nfm.wroclaw, WROCLAW.pl. That's nfm.wroclaw.pl. Gramophone podcasts are free, so if you enjoy them, then a really great way to support our work is to take out a subscription to Gramophone Magazine. Over 13 issues a year, we bring you hundreds of reviews by our expert critics, as well as in-depth articles about the latest classical music releases and the most exciting musicians of the day. And if you head over to gramophone.co.uk/subscribe and enter the code podcast20 in the checkout, you can even get a 20% discount off any subscription package. We really value your support. And consider leaving a review or rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. And do look out for another Gramophone podcast very soon.